Good morning. Making decisions that value water, which is part of the seminar Navigating Uncertain Waters, Shifting Powers, Sharing Values. I am Roberto Silva, working in the Hydrology and Water Resources Division of the World Meteorological Organization, and I will be your host for today. Yesterday, we reflected on how we can make a difference in addressing power inequalities in our work and which political choices we can make that shift power to ensure the right to water for all. I now show a word cloud of the session with keywords of the discussion. We identified that power and politics play a major role in the distribution of water rights, and that those rights are influenced by local, national, and global drivers. Some of those global drivers are foreign trade, development cooperation policies, and international financial institutions, to name a few. We learned that discussing water issues requires careful and empathetic listening to others and courage for self-reflection. Once this is done, we can place distribution of water on top of our political agenda, and the next step is to become more mindful of social and cultural context. This allows us to start understanding the different value people give to water and to start developing an awareness of the particularities of the communities we belong to or work for, and engage with them in ways that are relevant to their needs and customs. Today, we will take the knowledge from the previous session, and don't worry, you don't need to have participated in that session to understand this one. And we will move ahead to listen to the voice of different sectors whose decisions have an impact on water management. Sectors like community-based organizations, multilateral banks, government, UN agencies, and the academia. They will provide their views related to the decision-making process that affect how water is managed. So why is this important? By giving a place to all actors, we put value in them, in the water uses and their decisions, and thus provide new values to water. In this way, we can leverage technical, social, economical, and political interactions and any potential trade-offs to meet the water needs of all, empowering people with the right information and ensuring no one is left behind. More people at the table also means a fairer distribution of water rights and allocations so that the precious resource is evenly distributed and accessed. Before we head into the session, I invite you to use the chat box in Paddable, so in the World Water Week platform. We will be monitoring it constantly. Your questions will enrich the discussion throughout the session. Moreover, we would like to hear your thoughts about this important topic through answering the question in the poll, in the tab to your right in the platform that you have. The question is what should be prioritized to ensure inclusive water-related decision-making? It could be actors, mechanisms, activities. The results will not only help make you part of the conversation, but will be also carried forward to our next session tomorrow, focusing on building resilient institutions. Please do not use full sentences when answering this question. You use one or two keywords. So now I will just briefly mention the flow of the session. It consists of these parts, and we will have video presentations. Then we will have questions to 4 panelists, followed by a panel discussion with follow-up questions. And if there's time, we will be able to also take questions from the audience. A wrap-up of the discussion will be made, and finally, we will have some closing statements. Now, to move ahead, let me introduce you to our facilitator for the next parts, Kay Namba, the Young Scientific Program Committee member of our seminar. She is an independent consultant whose work focuses on water governance. Dear Kay, thank you for being here. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Roberto. I'm excited to be here and happy to walk all of you through our group of great presenters today. So to set the scene, I'm pleased to start with 2 video presentations. And if you have any questions for the videos, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat box and the presenters will be able to answer. So the first one is from Stefan Döring and Kristina Petrova from Uppsala University with a presentation called Connecting the Dots, Resilience Amid Flooding, Drought, and Conflict.
Apologies. Great.
Welcome everyone to our presentation, and thank you very much for having us. My name is Kristina Petrova, and I work at the Department of Peace and Conflict Research and Center for Natural Hazard and Disaster Science at Uppsala University.
Hello, also from my side. My name is Stefan Döring. I'm from the same department, and I'm also a member of the Research School for International Water Corporation. So as conflict researchers, we often are interested in both like what explains conflict. So for example, how does migration and water affect violence, but also how does violence shape migration and other factors such as water. One way of war having an impact on this nexus is through the destruction of infrastructure or agriculture, but also more directly, how do like fighting and war itself lead to migration and refugees. And often people have faced very many difficulties through access to water for nutrition or sanitation. And this like feeds into this problem. But also we have to think about natural hazards, which even aside from conflict can influence migration. Something that's often not portrayed as much perhaps in the media is also that displacement due to violence, even though it's often very grave, does lead to fewer displacement due to violence is smaller in scale as displacement due to natural disasters. And that's really important also to keep in mind for policymakers. And this is despite a recent uptick in recent violence.
What we know as well is that many of the countries that are most vulnerable to the consequences of a changing climate are also experiencing armed conflict. So for example, in the last 10 years, 60% of disaster deaths took place in the most fragile states. But in spite of that, disaster risk reduction is still to an extent discussed as an apolitical process and separate from vulnerabilities that stem from armed conflict experiences. Now, better understanding how to reduce disaster risk in conflict settings also plays an important role in advancing the global goals and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. To address this question, in our current project, we specifically look at both climate-related disasters and conflict, and look at how exposure to those affect households' coping practices. Specifically, we look at the 2010 and 11 floods in Pakistan. So the floods affected more than 20 million people, and that made them the worst in Pakistan's modern history. Citizens also here have low access to formal methods of coping with those shocks, such as savings or formal insurances, and that makes government social protection especially important. We also know that Pakistan has a fragile security situation. So when we look at the relationship between natural hazards and coping practices in conflict settings, what we see is that in times of crisis, people who have been flood affected are more likely to seek help from religious or village leader, as opposed to trust the state government. And they're also more likely, given that actually the government of Pakistan actually provided flood relief, but they only provided this protection scheme to a subset of flood-affected citizens. So when we look at the flood-affected individuals, we see that those who benefited from the program actually engage in more community support after flooding. But when we look at those who were similarly affected but did not benefit from the program, we see that they had to cope on their own, right? So they sell their assets, or they tend to be displaced, or not being able to send their children to school. So one of the main takeaways from these results is that we can say that this shows an important role for the government social protection. So the role here is not only to restore livelihoods, but it's also to foster intercommunal trust, but also pro-social behavior in the future.
And this is also similar to what I see in my research, which focuses on water scarcity and communal violence, as well as water cooperation and cooperative behavior among refugees. And the main takeaway also is here that property rights and state capacity are main factors that can mitigate violence in water scarce regions, and that democracy in itself enables water cooperation. So some of our takeaways aren't these quick fixes, but are rather like long-term policy changes that go hand in hand with access to water. And we're really happy to discuss more of these things in the session later, or on Twitter or via email. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Stefan and Christina. It's very interesting to see the connections you made between resilience, conflict, and also climate, and also to learn that the property rights and the democratic mechanisms or state capacity you mentioned enable water cooperation and also mitigate violence. And we now move on to the next presentation, which shows a way in which such cooperation is achieved. So Dennis Mwanza, a senior watershed advisor working for Research Triangle Institute, gives us a presentation called Nigerian Urban Water Crisis, a Governance Crisis.
Nigeria's urban water crisis is a governance crisis. About half of Nigeria's 200 million people live in urban areas, putting a huge pressure on the already insufficient urban water infrastructure. Services provided are not only inadequate, but in decline. According to the 2015 data from the Joint Monitoring Program, access to piped water declined from 32% in 1990 to a paltry 3% in 2015. Now, at the heart of this urban water sector crisis is poor governance, resulting from a myriad of issues, including low accountability, lack of a clear policy, institutional, regulatory, and legislative framework, and minimal investments. This situation may seem dire, but all is not lost. Nigeria can address this crisis urgently with support from its citizenry and development partners. Generally, in fact, there is political will and support from state governors to address this crisis. The USAID Effective Water Sanitation and Hygiene Program, or EWASH, was launched aimed at improving urban water service delivery by strengthening the governance, financial, and technical viability of 5 state water boards in Abia, Delta, Imo, Niger, and Taraba states. In this short presentation, I will share how lessons and insights from EWASH's experience shows that addressing the governance crisis is key to improving access to piped urban water services in Nigeria. I also would like to note that EWASH is not the first program to seek to address water governance issues in Nigeria. Others include the urban water programs financed by the World Bank, African Development Bank, AFD, DFID, and indeed EU, and many others. So first, let me touch base on the setup of Nigeria's urban water sector. Services are provided by 37 statewide owned and operated water boards with limited capacity to serve urban people within their jurisdiction. These state water boards operate as de facto government departments with non-transparent or unregulated systems and processes, therefore susceptible to mismanagement. For example, staff, financial management, procurement of goods and services are all handled by state government leadership rather than the state water boards. System weaknesses are the consequence of an uncoordinated and fragmented operational framework. Operations are further hampered by low cost recovery, things resulting from low tariffs, low customer base, and poor billing and collection practices, and poor and or intermittent energy supply that requires utilities to pay huge costs of running generators. The EWASH program designed a reform program, starting with undertaking a political economy analysis to identify reform champions, enablers, and barriers to reforms. The reform champions helped us to develop appropriate policies, legislation, and regulatory frameworks, which were later approved by appropriate state government organs. The new laws led to the creation of state-owned corporations, water corporations, in the 5 states to operate commercially to meet their operation and maintenance costs. A regulatory framework was also designed to provide accountability and promote good corporate governance. Corporate governance with guidelines with details on the composition, process of appointment, as well as functions of the boards of directors were developed, as well as financial management capacity of the newly corporatized state water boards. So what were our key learnings from this process? For urban water sector reforms to succeed in Nigeria and indeed anywhere else, state-based or country-based political leadership need to take the bold stage decision of commercializing urban water services, granting financial, operational, procurement, and HR management autonomy. Secondly, engaging all key stakeholders is critical for governments to adopt appropriate policies and laws, so everyone is operating from the same page. Knowledge is power, remember? And lastly, but not least, reform decisions are political decisions. Political buy-in and political will, based on clear evidence, are key to achieving the desired goals of any water sector reform program. I would like to thank you.
Thank you very much, Dennis, for sharing how governance fragmentation affects urban wash in Nigeria and how political will and support from the state. But also you mentioned mobilizing champions or change agents such as civil societies and the media or the corporate sector is vital for making any advance on providing access to water. So we see that access to water can mitigate conflicts and that there's a need for long-term policy process. And this sets the scene to our discussion with the next panelist. And I have a remark now to the audience. Please remember that you can write comments and questions in the chat box. And now we go to our panel discussion. So we have an amazing set of panelists from different sectors. And if you are interested in knowing more about the great works done by the panelists and the abstract presenters, you can refer to the detailed bios of the speakers and their publications and resources in this session page by clicking in the tab File on the Passable. And now in our panel, we have Violet Matil, Executive Director of the Millennium Community Development Initiatives, and Raul Munoz, Senior Water and Sanitation Specialist from the Inter-American Development Bank, and Johannes Kerman, Director of Water Cryosphere of the World Meteorological Organization, and Nicheri Moripe, the Chief Director of Global Cooperation and Executive Support, Strategic Partnerships in the South Africa Department of Water and Sanitation. So now that we have our panelists ready, I will start with questions for each of them. So the first question goes to Raul, representing multilateral banks who provide loans and grants to member nations to fund projects that support social and economic development in Latin America. So my question for you, Raul, how do you promote bringing traditionally left out sectors to the table? What compromises are they willing to make? Raul, you have 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you so much, Kay, for having us at the IDB today in this very interesting session. Actually, inclusive governance is actually one of the main pillars of the IDB working in water. As you all know, the IDB is the main financer for Latin America as an MDB. Latin America, for most of the people of the region, when you talk about water, people think about the Amazon River. So actually, Latin America has around 1/3 of the global water resources, which means basically 4 times more water per capita than the rest of the world. But actually, the situation is different depending where you think or you focus, because the distribution is very uneven. Around actually 40% of the territory today is under water stress conditions. So just to give you an idea, 12 of the main cities in the region within the last 4 years have been going through very serious water crisis. You have Sao Paulo, you have now Chile, you have the main cities in Bolivia a couple of years ago. So water security is a threat. And in thinking on the main consumer of water, which is agriculture, which is around 70 to 80% of the total water demand in the region, is 90% mostly rainfed. So, and the future estimated increase on demand for agriculture, we need to increase the rate of irrigation, so that would put more pressure on the water resource allocation. And actually, today in many countries in the region, we have an increasing number of water conflicts, right? So just to give you an idea, 1/3 of the water conflicts in Peru, 500 something in total, are water related. So 150 something are due to either water quality or water allocation, water quantity rights. So in response to that, the IDB has recently launched our water security initiative, which basically try to be more environmental centric with focus on the promotion of nature-based solutions, but actually also more social centric. We are working to have a more inclusive way on including people and local communities, especially the most vulnerable communities, in the design of the water infrastructure projects that we support, and in the water basin plans that we are also supporting in many places on the region. So in this way, we have two main tracks by which the IDB is working in inclusive governance, and that goes for water management and water infrastructure. The first one is obviously the environmental and social safeguards. We have recently approved by the IDB board the new environmental and social frameworks, which has specific tools for ensure compliance in terms of social inclusion and public participation during project design, and a specific policy for indigenous communities, gender, and the use of natural resources. An issue very sensitive is obviously the water rights one that goes to a specific project. We have a few samples that we can also share to the audience. And the second track is innovation. So we are trying to innovate, for instance, in promoting more and more modeling and decision support tools. So basically technical innovation. For instance, we have Hydrovic, which is a hydrological modeling covering the whole region, by which we are working in water balances in many places around Latin America for project design, by which we can have informed decision with local stakeholders to have a participatory way of designing a project. So in this way, you can show the benefits and costs of implementing certain water conservation measures of initiatives, ensuring that people will commit. We understand what with these specific interventions, so we can ensure compliance with the public participation on the project design. And secondly, in innovating by the promotion of nature-based solutions. So for local communities, sometimes it's more difficult to understand the benefits of promoting green infrastructure versus traditional or gray projects. So we have the water funds mechanism, which is basically a participatory process. In many places, actually, our fund is creating a governance in places where we don't find official water governance at a basic level. And the fund is basically a way to compensate the interest of the water users in the urban areas with the local communities in the upstream catchment. So by promoting conservation measures, training, and compensation and payments for ecosystem services to ensure water security in the main urban centers in Latin America. We have around 25 water funds supported across the region in the context of the Latin America Alliance for the Water Funds, in alliance with the TNC and the FENSA Foundation. And I can say that it's a way in which we are ensuring that the local stakeholders are the owners of the decision on how the water management is made. And so I think I went through the 5 minutes, and thank you so much for your time, and open to any questions you may have.
Yeah, so thank you, Raul, for guiding us through the way IDB strives to include everyone for the decision-making process, as you mentioned, ownership and also social-centric, and also highlighting the use of knowledge and technical information to achieve this. And now I would like to ask Violet from her perspective, representing civil society organizations. So Violet, I would like to ask you, how do we ensure transparency and inclusion in the decision-making process?
Violet, you're muted.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kay. So I'll use my experiences working in Kenya to illustrate how we promote transparency and decision-making, and also just some suggestions of how even governments and also international financial institutions can promote more inclusion with regards to water management. I think one of the first critical starting points of promoting more inclusion in decision-making in the water sector is to acknowledge that water is one of the most highly political issue and resource in the whole world. And water is a political issue at the very local level, where somebody can block you from getting access to water because they own the land next to a river or a water body. And then even at transboundary level, countries have to discuss how to share water resources, counties, local governments, countries. Transboundary water issues are very political. In Africa, we have the Nile River, which requires countries to discuss how do we share this water. So by acknowledging that, we already start to put it on the table as a political issue. In addition to that, then we start now to try to provide mechanisms for people to participate in decision making. And when we look at our countries, for example, like Kenya, Kenya is 80% is classified as arid and semi-arid. So it's a water-stressed country. So that means water is a highly political issue. And with regards to that, you look at from the colonial times, prioritization of water was given to supplying the urban areas, especially supplying the Europeans with water in Nairobi. And I use the example of the Roiro Dam that was constructed during the colonial time to just illustrate how the decision-making processes have changed over time. So during that time, it was very clear. The priority was Europeans in the city. So this dam was constructed upstream of Nairobi to supply water to the Europeans. The decision-making actually, even the discussion was between some Europeans who are farming upstream and the large European community within the city. But they managed, and up to today, people living around this dam do not have access to water because that was the way decisions were being made. Fast forward to today, you'll find that there's a second dam that has been proposed still on the Roiro River. And this dam is being financed through financing from the Deutsche Bank of France and Germany. But in this situation, it is happening in a situation where there's been devolution of power. We now have 47 counties. So now there's pushback where the communities are asking, why is water being taken all the way to the city, bypassing our communities? So that sets a stage for a process where decision-making can become much more inclusive, because now people are asking all the way at the local level, our rights are being trampled upon. Can we also come to the table to discuss these decisions being made over our water? So by providing a mechanism where communities can actually participate in decision-making in a constructive manner, you then avoid a situation where eventually there's conflict because they were not involved in the process. And it's an expensive process. So the other thing is to accept that there are vested interests when it comes to water. Private sector wants to make profit, but that doesn't have to be in conflict with people wanting water for their subsistence use if our governments can assist to balance these interests. So another issue is that to acknowledge that infrastructure for water is very expensive. So we need to look at the role of international financial agencies and how they sometimes bulldoze our governments because our governments require money for developing infrastructure, sometimes to build infrastructure that is not really a priority for our societies or our communities, but it is more of a priority for their own profit making at the global level. So the role of international financial institutions also, we need to start acknowledging, and we need to have professionals who can understand all these different roles and become honest brokers to balance the different roles and the different interests in the water sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Violet. You touch upon a very important aspect regarding needed awareness and knowledge in the communities you work on. And this should be also solved by sharing meaningful information at the local level, but also at the transboundary level, which can be very sensitive and highly political, as you said. You also raise a very important point that water-related conflicts are not due to governance failure, but are also rooted in colonial history. And this brings me to our next panelist, Johannes Kerman from WMO. So WMO is a UN specialized agency that cooperates with member states on weather and climate and the resulting distribution of water resources. So Johannes, my question is, how does water information empower sectors and strengthen decision-making process?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Kay. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be part of this event today. I think, first of all, we need to, again, realize that a sector is a construct. That's a word that we use to describe really the integral of all the different stakeholders that have to interact in a sector, and this can be agriculture or health or what, but really also the sectors are interlinked through the use of water. And for me, there are two keywords in this whole debate, and I want to highlight them up front, and those two are transparency and trust. Without those two T's, nothing works in managing water or in having people on the process in an inclusive way. I think there I would like to highlight a couple of things in the minutes I have. One thing up front, and also a little bit in relation to what Violet has just said, it is the role of government to balance the economic interest with what the poor need to really for their physical integrity. And I think in many of the countries that I have seen, there are not sufficient legal frameworks to really prioritize the human right of physical integrity over business interests or over particular private interests. So I think we need absolutely to work all together, different governments, the international community, to make sure that it is known and also agreed that we need to really prioritize the basic human rights in national legislation. And this is one thing up front that I wanted to say also in reaction to what Violet has said. I mean, I know how difficult this is in practice, but I think we need to agree on that. That's an important part. Access for all is another, key that relates to transparency and trust. There is no transparency and trust if only certain people have access to data or information. So to do that, I think we have to much more promote the value of data and information, and to work with people to have them understanding what they can do with this information. So I have 4 children. Of the 4, 2 didn't want to learn how to read. They were not interested. But then when we forced them, or when we worked with them to learn how to read, they realized, hey, I can access all these cool stories and books. So you need to go to the people and to work with them to actively promote that they make use of the benefit they can get from data. To then 2 points, I think we need more validation of information that people can use either for planning or for disaster risk reduction or mitigation. We know in WMO that roughly 60% of our people who provide information and data don't really know what the people who receive these data do with it, or how they can understand this data. So we throw out a lot of information, but often this is too complicated or too uncertain, or what do we do with it now? And that's not a problem of a country in Africa or Asia. That just happened now in Germany, where way too many people died in some flood events. So we need to translate the information so that people want to use it and can understand it. And we need more incentives. I think that there should be no official, at least, development cooperation without making sure that this money that is needed to give people access to decision processes and to how to use data is an integral part of the program. So no more dams without inclusive scheme of how we can evaluate the benefit of this. So we need really a carrot and a stick there. We need incentives, but we also need to say, well, if that's not included, then it's just not on. A big dam doesn't help if all the people who are around this dam cannot understand what this dam does. So I am near my time. I think I want to again repeat that I think it's about transparency and trust. We need these two T's, and we need to be simple. We have way too many, way too complicated informations, and we need to make sure that we get the 80 or 90% right and simple that people will actually use to take a decision. And that works in terms of a weather forecast, but it doesn't yet work in terms of how we need to plan hydro resources into the future with climate change. Thanks a lot, and happy to answer any questions later.
So thank you, Johannes. Indeed, trust and transparency is key to trust and transparency among different stakeholders is key to achieve more inclusive decision making. And you also mentioned that access to information and the need for policy relating to sharing is vital for ensuring water rights, but empowering water-dependent sectors and also including all stakeholders, such as the private sector. So such policies can be brought by government. So I would now like to ask Nicheri, representing the government sector. So Nicheri, what are the considerations to be taken to ensure balance between socioeconomic development and water access and rights for all?
Good morning, Madam Moderator and all. I really think for me, the buzzword here in the question that I'm given will be consideration and balance. I think for me, really, what comes to mind when you start asking yourself this kind of a question is that the consideration that everyone in this world, in this country today should have is that where do we start? My first consideration would be water is still right to life. If that is still the case, do we have equity that would balance between those who just need this water for drinking and for washing, just for them to think that they enjoy the right to water, which is not bulk use of water, just for them to think that they are considered. And you will think that if we are really doing that, we should talk about access. Who should provide access? And those three considerations put on the table, who should then prioritize and put them? Obviously, they come out of political decisions as per the session yesterday. And political decisions will bring about what we call regulation. Regulation will then prioritize who gets what and how much and when and how do we pay and how do we do that. Then that will then obviously answer the question to say, if we have to strike a balance between the issue of equity and the issue of consideration, and we look at what countries usually do, the first thing that we see is that we consider what will develop the countries. And obviously that would be business, that would be those with money, those who can afford to pay for the water. And that then tells us that the priorities will be lined up according to that. You will first look into who are the contributors in terms of economic development, which will be big business. You will look at those who are organized, like your water use associations, your business sector associations and all of that. Then you go down, you get those who are not organized, who are coming as individuals, who just want to open the tap and get those drops of water. They are not organized, they are not represented. Their voice can only go through their political representatives. And does that happen? That is the question. And then those people usually are in different places. You'll find them in urban areas or in rural areas or even in informal settlements. And that also is another key thing. Those in urban areas might access the water, but those in rural areas and informal settlements might be the last in the list. So we really have to start thinking about informing these people how these decisions come about and how they can get their voices heard, because I don't think the water that goes to a woman in a household of 3 can really make a big impact on what we want to use as water security or as what. But also, they need to be explained to, because they see pipes passing through their communities, as Violet said. Those pipes passes their communities because they are paid for. They might be going to a mining construction or a mining company there. It might be going to Coca-Cola, what they need water. It might be good because they pay for that and they contribute a lot to the development of a country. They will be given considerations. Therefore, for me, really, we need to start looking at who should be. There are compromises that are looked at. The question is those that I've talked about who are not organized, usually they are the most compromised. We can talk about the compromisers and the compromised, because those who compromise others are the ones who will have power to do that. And those who are compromised are those that cannot even voice their issues and put them on the table. So when they are compromised, does a country feel the impact on the compromise that's put on them? That's another big question. We do not know. When business doesn't get water, we know that it will be in the news, it will be everywhere. Therefore, I think the word that we should now look into here is equity and equilibrium. We can't get a balance. There's just no balance. The scale is very much skewed and it falls into one side if you look at it. And for me, really, you know, we have countries where water can be only used by communities for religious beliefs, just for baptizing, a little river, a little something there just to get people baptized there. And they are happy that they've got that and they think they own that. But we've got a farmer who wants a big dam owned and regulated and given. And I think that's where we are. The balance for me, it's much important. Access and equity. Thank you.
So thank you, Nicheri, for bringing the view from the government perspective and highlighting the need for consultation and also to bring priority to traditional left out sectors. And also you raised equity and consideration and balance. And a big thanks to our panelists for sharing your initial thoughts with us. Now I would like to ask some follow-up questions, starting with Raul. So Raul, as a representative of financial institution, you care about making loans, and you presented IDB's policy to ensure social inclusion, and also safeguarding affected communities from water infrastructure projects. My question is, have you encountered any conflicts with affected communities? And if so, how did you solve the problems?
Well, yeah, usually when you work in financing infrastructure projects independently, this is where it's very easy to find conflicts. And water obviously is a very sensitive issue. It's very easy to find conflicts around, especially when you work with water allocation around a water project. So just to give you an example, today we presented a project that we approved a few years in Bolivia. It's a multi-purpose project for El Alto and the municipality of Batallas up in the Cordillera Real. So a standard timeline for a project be approved by the IDB board is around 8 months. It took us around 4 years to approve this project, mainly because social conflicts around the water allocation. So basically, we have to go through a very comprehensive and in-depth negotiation and socialization process with the communities until we got an agreement, and obviously the project reflected that on the design, and we were able to approve the projects. Yeah, so yes, it's very common. It takes a lot of effort in terms of socialization and consultation, of course.
Thank you. And now, Violet, what do you think is the main barrier to be tackled to ensure civil societies raise their voice to achieving rights to water? And what do you think governments can do better after having heard Micheli's statement? You're muted.
Okay, thank you, Kay. So according to our experiences, I think we all need to work hand in hand with our governments to assist build capacities of communities. One, like Jedi said, to get organized. And we in Kenya, we are the whole country, the government has delineated 1,274 sub-catchments. And in each of these catchments, we are supposed to form a water resource users association. But of course, because the country is big, the government does not have all the resources to be able to stimulate the formation of these water resource users association. So civil society can come and assist the formation of these, mobilize the communities to form these water resource users association so that they can participate in a constructive manner with government. And that way, even government will be able to sit with them and listen to them. So if we work hand in hand with government, we'll be able to achieve much more.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And now to Johannes. So both you and Violet raised the importance of socializing technical information. And this can include communities earlier to the decision-making process. And you also raised, how do you translate, how does WMO translate this information? And how do you ensure that information is distributed equally and validated by users across different generations and living in rural and urban areas?
Yeah, that's the Nobel Prize question. So I cannot give the one size fits all or the correct answer to this question, but I think we need to work more with, I have a very positive experience. I was cooperating with the Chilean government on developing rural and communal development plans in southern Chile, and the people came to the table because they realized if we assist in setting up certain rules, that then of course the government needs to ensure that these rules or objectives are respected by the different players that influence water resources. They came to the table and they don't need additional funds. I don't know if this works for all the countries, but if there's also trust in the government, that the government will enforce and the word is ugly, but ensure, I wanted to say police, but ensure that these decisions can be taken and sustained, then I think the people have an interest to come to the table. One aspect in brief is, if you want to think about which stakeholders we need first and foremost to be included in the process, it is quite simple. You can look at those who are most deprived, and you can look at those who are most impacted by disasters, floods and droughts. Select those people. If they are dead, you can't talk to them anymore, but look at where these people are, what conditions these people have to suffer, and go there and work first with those people, not with all the other people that we know, because we can communicate and we have electronic media and stuff. So we need to deconnect from our modus that we have, that the millennial way of communication is the solution to everything. No, we have to go to the most deprived. And the last thing I want to stress is we need more discussion generally between young and old people in schools. If you look at the advances that have been made, I don't know, in environmental policies or energy transitions or whatnot, then it's a long process. It needs a lot of talking, and we need to give young people more voice, because that's where the future lies, and that's where step changes can be made. Old people will go a step left or a step right, but they won't change something dramatically until they're forced to. But the young people are more susceptible to say, okay, let's stop it, let's do things differently. So my children don't do driver's licenses because they don't believe in individual combustion car travel. So I think that's the way forward.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you also for sharing good practices from Chile, but also you pointed out, identify who is vulnerable and also including the youth to dismantle the information. That's very interesting. And lastly, Nicheri, so we have heard that many times water-related solutions and projects aiming at the development of communities are usually top-down and largely driven by norms, values, and interests that often do not match those of communities that they target. Why is this so? How do we bridge this gap?
I think the first step that needs to be done is to ensure that those who are representative of the people do what they are supposed to do. Because as I said before, organized groups can actually have one big voice to put something on the table and be listened to. We have learned a lesson in South Africa. We've seen it every day when we had our lockdowns. People came and approached the presidency, approached the corona committees to say that we as restaurants want this, we as beverage companies want this, we as farmers want this, and those voices were considered. But because the top-down issue comes because the arrow faces one way. There's no arrow that faces the other way. If the arrows were crossing, then we would know that the voices would meet somewhere. They cannot meet because the arrow is only one way. People must take what comes from top going down to them, whether it lands well with them or not. Usually it doesn't. But as governments, we know going forward, I think governments are now putting policies that are pro-people, that are actually in favor of people due to the voices that are coming in splinter from different political parties, from people themselves. The whole issue of social media and the whole issue of people being able to just go and make a call or send open letters has opened up a new avenue in bringing up some kind of input into policies and actually shaping policies and making governments to be able to be better considerate and better looking into the issue of equity and making sure that everyone's voice matters. I think governments are shaping up very well, and we really look forward to even stepping right into the right direction.
Thank you so much, Nicheri. I think we have like 2-3 minutes to ask questions to each other if there's no question from the chat box. And please join, Dennis, Stefan, and Christina, please join the discussion if you have questions.
Or remarks.
Yeah, or remarks.
I do have a question. I want to check with Johannes. You are talking about financing and all of that. The big question that comes always from people, and that causes at times vandalism and people rejecting projects at the beginning or even in the middle and turning them into white elephants, is that people do not know how funding is done. Something that is their taxpayer, the tax monies. Some would think that there's corruption that came in, it was much money coming from donations. Some would think that we deserve better because this is money that comes. So the issue of funding and financing projects like water and sanitation projects really sometimes need to be very sort of consultative, and at times they need to be open so that people should know even when the shortcomings are there, and people understand that it's a matter of funding or it's a matter of not having or having more. Or, yeah.
Yeah, I mostly agree with you. I think that's why I said we need to have a basic agreement or even an international guideline that this and this much of investments in infrastructure development or what in development need to be reserved and targeted for a collaborative design process where probably, I don't know, what example can I make? If people in my hometown, it's a small town in the Black Forest Hills in southern Germany, would have designed the road that is being built now, the new road, it would have looked much different. This was a typical administrative-led planning process. They count the cars, they say that's what we need to do, and there is no inclusive process with the people. So we need to reserve funds for the planning process, and we need to reserve funds for long-term maintenance and engagement of local people who need to be stakeholders and owners of the infrastructure. If all the infrastructure that's relevant for the people is always privately owned, we have this problem. I'm not against private. I'm not going to go into a discussion about private property, but the problem is if there can be one private sector interest that prevents the human right of so and so many other people, then that is a problem, and that needs to be mediated through incentives and through also the possibility for the people to do something about this process. If they have the feeling we can't do anything anyway because the big guys are deciding, and they are not interested to participate. So I think that's a big problem. I don't think that there's not enough financing. I think we just use the financing in a very bad way in terms of 3 or 5 year projects without real inclusive process for people to own and manage what they need to be able to own and manage to secure their livelihoods.
Yeah, I thank you. I agree that the efficient use of funds also relates to government or private sector's accountability and transparency, good governance. So now, thank you. So thank you so much for the panelists. So I just want to quickly wrap up the session. So today we heard from you and from panelists from different sectors with different interests and responsibilities, and asked their views. Asked your views on how are decisions around water being made. And we covered many aspects of water and politics, ranging from urban wash to conflict and migration, nexus, rights to water, as well as the importance of water information as means of empowerment. And we also learned that all actors should demand access to information, higher transparency, accountability, participation for water decision-making at all levels. And in the water sector especially, we often see conflicting interests and power dynamics that negatively affect deliveries of equitable and efficient water services, especially for the most vulnerable. That's why building trust among actors is very important. And from the interventions today, we have seen what kind of issues arise from mismanagement of water, the consequences and ways in which they can be tackled to promote inclusiveness and develop policies. We also have learned that lack of access and use of information, limited participation, accountability, and other governance problems can be barriers to achieving fair and equitable and sustainable water management. And we can also see from the responses that in general, decision makers are willing to go beyond their own interests and towards a more collaborative approach. We need more collaboration across different sectors. We need to ensure that we have stronger institutions that supports this kind of approach, avoiding driving participants apart, as mentioned by Roberto at the beginning. And now back to you, Roberto. Thank you. Also, a big thank you to all panelists. This has been a very interesting panel discussion.
Thank you very much. So I will present you now Aaron Salzberg to give just a very brief closing of the session. He is the director of Water Institute at the University of North Carolina. Aaron, thank you, please. You have the floor.
Thank you, Roberto. Look, I don't think you need me. Kay gave a great wrap up and a great set of speakers. But look, if I had to pick 3 words to describe what we heard today, it's governance, governance, and governance. That water is not just a technical, financial, and social challenge, but a political challenge. and the importance of good governance and the role of governments in reducing conflict, promoting cooperation, expanding access to basic services, providing protections from floods and droughts. This came through from every one of our speakers. And so it might not be worth a Nobel Prize, but it's clear that not only can governments not walk away from these challenges, but they really need to be at the center of establishing the institutional mechanisms that improve transparency and access to data, drive water-sensitive development approaches, create the incentives and balanced policies that promote sound and inclusive and transparent water resources management within their own countries and even beyond. So, this takes us to the last part of our conversation, and that's tomorrow. So please join us where we'll hear from His Excellency, the Honorable Minister for Water and Sanitation from South Africa, and other stakeholders about the steps that we can take to institutionalize decision-making processes that engage stakeholders openly and fairly, that are science-based, that are able to adapt to the changing social, political, and hydrological factors. I think it's going to be an exciting conclusion to our 3-day journal. And maybe you can close, Roberto, if you've got the slide to put up from our stakeholders, and we can see a little bit about their views on what they heard today as we close out. So back to you, Roberto.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Indeed, I will now share the work cloud just to see the final results that we had. Just 1 second, please. So with this, we can see, oh, it's loading, sorry. Sorry, reloaded. Okay, there we have frameworks, community, the youth, inclusion and transparency, women, so equity. So I think it can summarize very well as well. But the one that we will have to add there is governance, as Aaron mentioned. So thank you everybody. Thank you for your participation, and I will post the link to the next session, as Aaron mentioned, in the chat box. And thank you very much for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.